Hello and welcome to this video. I'm sat in my studio. It's absolutely freezing cold. I got my coat, I got my scarf, and in the background I got my fan heater running, so I apologise for that little low level noise in the background. If you want to know what it is, that's what it is, because people always ask questions like that. So what is this video going to be called? This video is going to be called the 10 greatest progressive rock albums from 1973. Why pick on 1973? Well, it was 50 years ago, so all these albums I'm about to discuss are going to get their 50th anniversary this year, and I'm probably going to be talking about them. And if you go over to my Patreon, I may even play some of them and actually go through them, because I've just got myself a new turntable down here. I'll just show it you again. I showed it you on the video I talked about 97. I'm so excited about that. See, you can see my turntable there. There it is. I've just acquired a turntable. So over on Patreon, I'm going to be playing some of these albums. You know, these albums have not been played for 25 years. They've been in storage. I pulled them out and put them into my studio, but I haven't listened to any of these for a long time. It's very exciting for me, as you could probably tell. So 1973, I've just shot a video where I describe culturally why 1973 was so important for progressive music. That's not just progressive rock, but also jazz fusion. Why it produced so many incredible albums, and really argued that it's almost like the summit of progressive music. It's where we reach the height, and then as we go over, we go down the other end. It's a very interesting year. When we look at progressive rock albums coming out at that time, we're dealing with absolute masterpieces. Albums that had changed the face of music and also sold millions and millions. I'm going to go through 10 of them now, and I'm going to rank them. And I'm going to rank them not just on whether I like them, right? It's not just going to be about that, but about their cultural importance, the effect they had, and also their popularity. That's really going to be a factor. I know proggers hate the idea of judging stuff in how popular it is, but you must remember that we're only talking about this genre now because certain groups sold tens of millions of albums. If they hadn't have done that, it would have gone into history and be forgotten. So shall we just crack on and look at these 10 albums? Right, so at number 10 on the list from 1973, I have Angel's Egg from Gong. Right, now this is a little bit of a personal choice. I absolutely love Gong. Right, I really like a lot of those Canterbury bands like Caravan, Hatfield and North. Gong sort of fit into that, but not quite, because there's a strong European element in there. But I feel that Gong are the best by far for me personally. Same things that goes for European prog. You know, I really love Focus, and you know, you got Can and Magma and Tangerine Dream and all those bands. But for me, Gong are the greatest European prog band, and they're an amalgamation of all these things together. I'm sure people are going to say they're not a European prog band, but they have influences and elements from Europe, right? They are by far one of my favourite progressive rock bands. In 1972, in 1973 actually, sorry. I think they made Flying Teapot in 1972, released in 1973, I think that's right. And Flying Teapot is the start of the Teapot trilogy, which includes Angel's Egg and then You in 1974. This is one of the greatest run of albums in progressive rock for me. So we get to choose one of between Angel's Egg and Flying Teapot, and Angel's Egg just pips the post for me because of PM Orlon on drums and the input of Steve Hillage on guitar. I know you're going to argue that Steve Hillage is actually on Flying Teapot, but he's on in a very small capacity, only just joined the band. So we get sort of classic Gong sound, and I think Angel's Egg, even more than You, which is my favourite Gong album, Angel's Egg personify that quirky, trippy Gong sound. It's an absolute masterpiece. You know, it's they find themselves on Virgin Records. Of course, Richard Branson's label at that time was so important in terms of the development of progressive rock, and we'll be talking about that in a bit, so that's probably going to clue another album on this list. But yeah, so at number 10 I have Angel's Egg, the incredible second part of the trippy trilogy of the Pothead Pixies coming to Earth and basically sprinkling their magic potions and causing all sorts of chaos and, you know, entertaining occurrences, right? And if you haven't heard it, go and check it out now. It's absolutely incredible. As a kid growing up, it was also Pierre Mollon's drumming. You know, the drum kit sounds really earthy and natural, completely unlike a drum kit would sound today in a modern recording studio. It sounds like you've got a couple of mics up there, it just sounds like it's in the room, but then you hear the virtuosity of Pierre Mollon's drumming, you know. Absolutely beautiful album. There's long sections that do the whole trippy build-up thing, but the thing I liked about Angel's Eggs is it's sprawling and epic, but it's like epics made out of tiny little tracks, which are actually really accessible. Right, so I think I've said enough about that. I want to get cracking on this. Right, so at number 9, I have Overnight Sensation by Frank Zappa. So when I did this list, I thought, I've got to put Zappa on it. People always tell me off when I miss Zappa off progressive rock lists. Zappa is so huge. I'm doing this channel, I've come to believe that Zappa is the first progressive musician ever. He lays the groundwork for progressive rock and jazz fusion right back from 1965 onwards. He's an absolute giant. Because he does much more than that as well, I don't always think of him as a progressive artist. Right, so, but he is, of course he is. So when this list came up, I thought, right, they've got to have a Zappa album. So I got my dates out and checked out. And Zappa's usually making about 5 or 6, 7 albums a year. But in 73, there's just one album. But it's one of his most commercially successful and one of his greatest albums. And that album is Overnight Sensation. Overnight Sensation can really be seen as the, how we could say, it's the introduction of the funky fusion influenced George Duke band, right? Which eventually features Chester Thompson on drums, you know, Ruth Underwood on percussion, Tom Fowler on bass, Napoleon Murphy Brock on vocals and saxophone. That, you know, that's the classic lineup. For most Zappa fans, it's their favourite lineup, you know. And they do a run of albums starting in 73 with Overnight Sensation, then Apostrophe, and then we get One Size Fits All, and of course we get the incredible live album Rocks In Elsewhere, and of course with Zappa we could go into all the myriad of live releases and alternative tracks and all the stuff that's out there. Overnight Sensation was a change for Zappa. You know, before then he was peddling his sort of doo-wop meets modern classical approach to rock music. Very spiky, very intricate, avant-garde, experimental. You know, that's the mothers of invention. In 1971, some deranged fan pushes him off a stage. He breaks his hip or his leg. He's in a wheelchair for a long time, and he has to do something else. So he goes into sort of big band music. I was going to say orchestral, but it's big band music. And at that time, fusion's emerging, and you can hear he's listening to fusion and he's influenced by it. And on albums like Waka Joaka and the Grand Wazoo, we have that sound, we have the introduction of fusion. Zappa gets back out on tour, and he gets paired with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and it's very interesting how he reacts to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. You know, Zappa's the great avant-garde musician. He's used to blowing everybody's mind. And he goes out and he sees the Mahavishnu Orchestra, you know, with an absolutely new sound, basically taking the audiences to a new level. This is such a big moment for progressive music, and of course this is the groundwork of jazz fusion being laid. And he changes his band. You know, at that point he changes his band, he starts to change, and he goes into a funkier, more fusion approach. He's been working with Jean-Luc Ponty, the great jazz violinist at that point, you know, made the album King Kong, but he brings them into the band, and I've always felt bringing in Ponty into the band and then later on bringing in Chester Thompson is a nod to Zappa going more Mahavishnu. But what we actually get with Overnight Sensation is an album which is funkier, more accessible, slicker. The modern classical influences have been pushed aside a little bit, and also because of the scatological humour, and this, I warn you, is one of the most extreme albums with tracks like Dynamo Hum in terms of Zappa exploring that. We see him sort of finding a commercial place, you know, and this album sells a lot. I think it charted, and it enabled Zappa to then tour as a mainstream artist, you know. It's full of progressive rock brilliance, you know. one of the great Zappa albums of all time, and I would put it definitely in my 10 favourite Zappa albums, which is saying a lot because how many are there? 100? Right, so that's what I got. Number 9, Overnight Sensation by Frank Zappa. All 1973, all about to have their 50th year anniversary. 50 years. It's a lifetime since these albums were released. We are living in a different era. Right, at number 8, I have an album that I thought I'm putting it on the list of progressive rock albums. It's definitely this band's most progressive moment, and I'm going to call it out and say it's a progressive rock album. It's the album Houses of the Holy by Led Zeppelin. Right, so every band at this time has come out, and all bands that are pushing the envelope in any way, shape or form back then are called progressive bands. It's not like now where prog rock means Genesis, yes. You know, Led Zeppelin would have been called a progressive band. Black Sabbath would have been called a progressive band, you know. But, you know, Zeppelin are the great exponents of blues rock put through the English aesthetic, right? The English aesthetic, I've discussed so many times, is a name for a collection of a sort of aesthetic approaches that is embodied in English art, literature, music, all right? Of course, you know, English bands, right, have got that in bucket loads. You know, the Beatles are full of the English aesthetic. You know, all progressive rock bands from Britain have got the English aesthetic. I call it the English aesthetic because the Scottish aesthetic and the Welsh aesthetic is actually subtly different, right? And I could talk about that as well, which is wonderful. Zeppelin really mined the English aesthetic on their third album, Led Zeppelin 3, and I think that's the X factor. That's the bit of magic potion that we drop into Zeppelin, which enables them to make perhaps their greatest album, which is Led Zeppelin 4, which is an absolute masterpiece. At that point, they are full of progressive rock goodness. Now, I'm pretty sure, you know, Robert especially would hate to be labelled as a progressive rock musician, you know, but on House of the Holy, we see the whole album expand. Now, I think one of the reasons for this is because they'd made enough money by this point to have their own recording studios in their house. So a number of the musicians were able to piece together tracks at home and bring them in. And I think John Paul Jones, who had basically worked in the 1960s as a multi-instrumentalist arranger, and he's an incredible arranger. You know, this guy had earned his living by arranging tracks for other people. His arrangement head comes in to Jimmy Page's compositional and sound world that he's created with these two incredible, you know, voices in John Bonham on drums and then literally up with Robert Plant. And Robert Plant's ethereal, you know, otherworldly, almost like Tolkien-esque, you know, lyrical content all comes together on this album. It's like Led Zeppelin expanded. It sounds like orchestral Led Zeppelin. Around about this time, of course, they'd gone to India and recorded with, you know, Indian orchestras. And there's an orchestral sound. There's an expansiveness. There's also a joy of just exploring genres and seeing how far we can go out. Exploring odd time signatures. You know, they're pulling in English folk music. They're pulling in reggae, soul, James Brown. You know, heavy metal. You know. It's just a brilliant album, and a track like Over the Hills and Far Away is such a beautifully concise progressive rock track, you know, which relates and does the same thing that, say, Rush do with The Trees, you know, that track. This is Led Zeppelin, it's Prog, House of the Holy, one of the greatest progressive rock albums ever made. Right, so shall we move on to number 6? At number 6, and I've done a video about this album, it's truly so important in the history of music, and it's so important in the history of progressive rock, and I always forget about it. And it is Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, you know, the album that launched the Virgin record label that would champion progressive rock at this time. This album is different to any other progressive rock album because all the other progressive rock albums are made by bands, right? At this point, suddenly, we have the studio technology that one person can go in and create their vision on their own using multi-tracking, right? If we look at all music now, right? All music can be made by someone on their own in their bedroom. This begins with Mike Oldfield with this album. It has its roots in people like Brian Wilson making Pet Sounds, but Brian Wilson still had to use other musicians, other engineers, producers, and to pull a whole communal thing together, although you can see it's Brian Wilson's vision. With Tubular Bells, we have this very young, genius musician, you know, ensconced inside a recording studio at night, going bonkers and making 2 sidelong tracks. There's a couple of guests on there, but they're brought in completely under Mike Oldfield's control. We really have here the high point of progressive music, and also the beginnings of where music's going to end up 50 years later. It's a fascinating album, absolutely brilliant. To my ears, I've always felt that side 1 is really great, side 2 is slightly less great. You know, I always felt that the ideas were fresh and new, which I think makes the album so exciting. But Oldfield then goes on to really, you know, do some of those ideas a little bit later. Of course, its use in the film The Exorcist propelled it into a stratosphere where it was one of the biggest albums and sold tens of millions of copies, thus making progressive rock the genre that we know now, that no one can ever argue with. You know, progressive rock sold way more albums than punk, so and that's it, you know. And doesn't matter what anyone says, what anyone criticises it, that's a fact and it won't go away. And Tubular Bells will be listened to in 100 years' time because the sheer weight of albums out there that people own, right? It won't go away. So that's what I've got at number 6. I have Tubular Bells at number... No, that was number... Oh, hang on. 10, 9, 8, 7. Yeah, number 6. I got a bit lost then. I got confused. I've got my list, but I forgot to put my numbers next to it. So I'm having to count, which... for progressive rock job, and we get confused when we have to count. Right, so anyway, what have I got at number 6? Brain Salad Surgery by ELP. Right, ELP. I did a video, and go back if you haven't seen it, it's quite humorous. I did a video where I decided to do my 20 best progressive rock bands. It's a monumental video on this channel, very, very important. The 20 greatest progressive rock bands. I wrote it all out, really thought it out, went through millions and millions and millions, and when I started to film the video, I got to number 3 on the list and realised I'd forgotten all about ELP. And you can watch me as I know they should be in the top 20 albums, and you could see me hurriedly putting them in. And even though I got to number 3 or number 2, and I think I made them joint second, rightly so, they should be joint seconds. They should be top of the list, one of the most important progressive rock bands in progressive rock music history. So why did I forget about them? And the reason is, for many years, I've always had a bit of a problem with ELP. Everything that progressive rock gets accused of, I don't think's true, except in ELP's case. They are overblown and pretentious. It is just a shallow display of virtuosity. You know, there's not much feeling there. You know, it's substance over content, all these things that get thrown at progressive rock. Is that right? Substance over content? I don't know. Anyway, and what John Peel said, a waste of talent and electricity. I did feel a little bit like that. When I was a kid, I loved ELP. I think really what happened to me is that the week I got into ELP, I got into the Mavish Nuxtra, and Mavish Nuxtra just seemed to come and trump this new band I'd got into. So this band I absolutely loved, I got the Best of ELP, actually. That's the first album I ever heard by them. And I thought, this is great, it's such a brilliant band. And then I got the Mavish Nuxtra and I was like, oh, like a little kid, oh, don't like this ELP anymore, I want that, I want the better one, you know. And that was really what happened, I'm afraid. But I carried on listening to them, and the first album I got that was a proper album was Trilogy, and that's still my favourite ELP album. I then got the first album, I got Works, I think, I got Live at Montreal, and I got Brain Salad Surgery. I think objectively, stepping back, Brain Salad Surgery is their peak in terms of everything ELP does. Anyway, doing this channel and trying to talk about progressive rock, you suddenly start to realise that many progressive rock bands are pretending to fuse classical music and rock music. They may not have the compositional and arrangement chops to be able to pull that off. A few progressive rock bands do. Keith Emerson is definitely one of those guys, and his work in the Nice is absolutely integral to the development of progressive rock. Greg Lake is a fantastic songwriter that is able to write a great acoustic tune. So he's a great songwriter. Carl Palmer is almost a definition of a progressive rock drummer. You know, bombastic, outlandish, you know, and over the top. Going back and listening to ELP again, and this is while this channel's been operating, and so this is really in recent times, I've got a renewed respect for them, and they're so much more than just being a sort of shallow waste of talent and electricity. It's so not true. They're pushing the envelope, and they're exploring rock music, pushing the boundaries of it. They have a complete commitment to creativity, innovation, and entertainment as well. You feel that this is a band selling a lot of records, taking all the money and spending on it, on getting even more outlandish to entertain us at home. You know, they want to blow our minds with their progressive rock mightiness, and I respect that. And on Brain Salad Surgery, they are at their peak doing that. What an incredible album, you know. It does so many things that we want from ELP. You know, we get the rock version of a classical piece of music with Jerusalem. We get the real experimentation with is it called Toccata? We get the comedy song that sounds a little bit like Chaz and Dave. Got to have one of those on there, which I used to find really difficult. And then I thought, why can't they be so dark and serious and then just give a little chink of light of humour in there? Why not? Frank Zappa does it. I like it when he does it. Why can't they do it? And of course, the 4-part symphonic Carnival 9 is one of the greatest moments in progressive rock, isn't it? Right, so that's what I have. Absolute masterpiece at number 6. At number 5, I have Tales of Topographic Oceans. As this year carries on and we get into the celebration of 50-year anniversaries, this album is going to get mentioned. Are we going to get a big box set reissue? What's going to happen? You know, there's going to be a lot of YouTube videos where people are talking about this and talking about the 50th anniversary of this prog classic. But this one is notorious, isn't it? More than respected. If you ever watch a progressive rock documentary and they want to poke fun at the excesses of progressive rock, we know we're going to have the stories of, you know, Yes stuck in a recording studio with hay bales and a plastic cow that you can milk, making a double album of basically one track in 4 suites over four sides about some weird esoteric guru's poetry that nobody really understands, right? That's how it was sold to me. In truth, it is not an overblown, indulgent album. It's actually very tightly composed. There are certain points, very minor points for me, where it sags, you know. And I think Rick Wakeman is right in that if they'd have just basically lost a side and pulled it down into a side and a half, this would be an absolute masterpiece. But it is a masterpiece. What we have here is the logical end of progressive rock. Somebody had to do this, and Yes did it, and thank God they did, because if they didn't, we would be wondering what it would have been like if a band at the peak of their powers, with a large budget, with lots of money to stay in the studio for months on end, made the most outlandish, sprawling, vast progressive rock epic that you could make at that time, which is a double album, right? This is what it sounds like. Now, for many years, I never really listened to this album. When I bought it, I was put off a little bit by side 2, which I actually think is fantastic now. I think that the sagginess is in probably giving Alan White a little bit too much drum solo time. Maybe that's a little bit of that, you know, a little bit of padding trying to get to a 4-side length by just padding it out by improvisation. Now on the following album, they explore sort of jazz rock improvisation even more on Relayer, but I think the conciseness of that album pulls it in. It's just a little bit flappy. I just feel like there's certain points where they are repeating certain parts just to get to that finishing line. I think that's definitely the thing with it. But I didn't listen to the album for a long time. And then I got one of those little things in the living room, where you could say, "Hey Google, tell me how many legs a donkey has." That thing that everyone has now. And we all sat there, and you could play music because I hadn't paid for the thing, so it wouldn't play what I wanted. So I was like, "Oh, play some progressive rock," and it would start to randomly play progressive rock. And it started with the randomly on comes the first track of Tales of Topographic Oceans, which I wish I could tell you. Is it The Revelation of something? I don't know. Can't remember the title of it. And this track starts up. Of course, I know it's Yes, and I know it's Topographic Oceans, but I haven't listened to the album, and I can't quite place it. So I'm sat there listening, and sometimes psychologically, to get yourself in a bit of a confused place where you're not judging the music and just listen. So I'm listening to it more going, this track's Yes, isn't it? It's not one of the ones I know that well. It's not Close to the Edge or Gates of Delirium. This is one of the ones off Topographic Oceans. It's not Ritual, which is the only one I ever really listened to. And being a drummer when I was a kid, I did listen to the Ancient quite a bit. But the first two sides I didn't listen to that much. It was absolutely mind-blowing. It was 100% Yes. I went back and listened to the album again. This is one of the great Yes albums. For some people, I think this will be the greatest Yes album, because if you like Yes and you want a great big dollop of Yes right in your face, Topographic Oceans every single time. So that's what I got at number 5. Absolute masterpiece. Is it overblown? Yes, it represents everything that 1973 represents in terms of progressive music. It's there on Topographic Oceans. I think when I put this video up, it will be the cover of Topographic Oceans. That's that's going to represent 1973. I've said I'm going to do it now. Let's see if I do. You'll know when you're watching this. At number 1974. No, sorry. At number 4, we have an absolute prog masterpiece, In a Glass House by Gentle Giant. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. I bet I end up talking a lot about this, because next week I am bringing in Steve Gould, also known as the Progmeister. He's a DJ that runs a progressive rock radio show, which is absolutely fantastic, called The Lost Art, and there will be a link in to that next week when Steve's on. And he also is the guy that puts on the Fusion Progressive Rock Festival in Stourport, just up the road from me, every year. He is definitely the Progmeister. He's going to be coming on to help me talk about Gentle Giant, because we haven't done a video on Gentle Giant, and we're also going to have a chat about Focus, 2 progressive rock bands that I absolutely love, but I feel I need to pull in the big guns to really get into there. I want to be able to chat about it and swap stuff, because my knowledge of these bands is not as full as I would like. Gentle Giant are definitely one of my favourites progressive rock bands. I came to them quite late. I do know the stuff pretty well now, but it's not stuff that I've lived with since I was like 14 years old, a lot of this other stuff. Gentle Giant emerged 1970, pretty much fully fledged progressive rock band. They are, I call them Prog's Prog. Right, so if you've got a friend and they're like into Fleetwood Mac or Simply Red or whatever, and they think they like music, and you go, oh, I'll play you some prog, and you stick on some King Crimson, and they're like, what the hell's this? Ooh, I don't know about these. Oh my God, it goes on for long, and all that reaction you get. Gentle Giant's a little bit like that for the casual progressive rock band. If somebody sits there and likes to listen to a bit of Supper's Ready, or Close to the Edge, and then you hit them with some Gentle Giant, it could be like, what the hell is this? So they are Prog's Prog. It's like Prog times 10. They are, I think, the greatest progressive rock band. If we sit back and, judge them on progressive rockness, they are absolutely over the top progressive rock. They don't do epics though. Right? They pack such a punch that most of their tracks are very short. They emerge in 1970 with the debut album. And then they bring out an album, I think in 71, called Acquiring the Taste, where they really start to explore this Gentle Giant sound. And this sound starts to develop. On Three Friends, we hear that sound even more. Many people feel like that's their best album. For me, it hasn't got John Weathers. As soon as John Weathers joins on drums, I'm a drummer, you see, and I'm influenced by these things. As soon as John Weathers joins on drums, you then, for me, get the full-on Gentle Giant sound, and we get Octopus, In a Glass House, and then Power and Glory. Those three albums are like the run. But it's really hard. This is why I've got Steve in to talk about the full catalogue, because we are dealing with masterpiece after masterpiece. So in 1973 we get the album In a Glass House. This is they're at their peak. There's many people who say that this is their greatest album. I would be quite happy to call it their greatest album. I listened to it this morning, again, just before this video, and I was like, yeah, this is unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. It contains some of the classic Gentle Giant tunes, and I really feel they've nailed it. Now, if you look at the history of this album, they were actually in a bit of disarray, because this album doesn't seem to get mentioned in the same breath as an Octopus, because they'd been dropped in America from their label. This album never got a release in the States. It only came in on import. The Columbia Records dropped them because they felt they were too commercial. Gentle Giant is based around three brothers, you know, Derek Shulman, Ray Shulman and Phil Shulman. Phil Shulman had left at this point, so they'd also been knocked, but you can tell they're at the top of their game. Right, this album should have been weaker, but it's not. It could well be their greatest album. It's really hard, and this is the quandary you have with Gentle Giant. Which is the best album? You know, I did a top 10 and I just plugged for Octopus. It could have been this album, could have been Power of Glory. It could have been Acquire the Taste, it could have been Three Friends. My favourite album by them is the first one I heard, Freehand. It could be Freehand for me. Even Interview's fantastic. Right? Have I missed any out? You know, it's like we can almost go through the whole catalogue. They're all brilliant. This album, the way I describe it is they're at their most proggiest. But also, it's quite accessible in a very proggy way. That's the only way I could describe it. Back then, you know, bands are experimenting with album structures a lot. You know, where you get close to the edge, where you get the side long track and then the 2 10-minute tracks on side 2. You get Thick as a Brick, which is just one track over the whole album. You know, we get people experimenting with different album structures. This is structured that, although there's no really super long tracks, but there's some 7-8 minute tracks. So you get a quite a long proggy 7 or 8 minute track, and then you get a little delicate track in the middle, like a sandwich, and then another long proggy track, and then you turn side 2 over, and you get another long track, a little delicate track, and then another big track. And I really like that. There's 4 absolute masterpiece epics, and of course the greatest one on here is the title track at the end, which is just incredible. Gentle Giant prog, which is a mixture of sort of medieval minstrel music, you know, mixed with heavy rock, the blues, and because they're multi-instrumentalists, you get these huge shifts in sound textures, you know. You know, they can come down, you know, to like tiny little percussion, you know, and acoustic guitar stuff, and then expand out to really quite heavy stuff. There's a lot of violin on this, you know. Again, 1973, they listed the Mavish Orchestra, because when I hear the opening of the title track In a Glass House with that violin melody playing, there's tinges of the Mavish on this. I'm sure that was an influence. I'd love to know that. Anyway, I'm going to move on from In a Glass House at number 4. Like these last 3 albums now, utter masterpieces. These are all masterpieces on this list to me, but here we have 3 albums, you know, and I put Topographic Oceans in as well on this, albums that really define the genre, you know. I think if you had Tales from Topographic Oceans and then the 3 albums I'm about to mention, and you had nothing else, you would have a good little progressive rock collection of 4 albums that pretty much would be very satisfactory, you know, in covering the genre and representing this fantastic music style that we love so. At number 3, I have Selling England by the Pound. Right, if you watch my channel and you watch it and you really study it, you will see me confusingly going from one Genesis album to the next to try and decide which is their best album. Right? For me, Genesis don't kick in until Phil Collins and Steve Hackett come in the band. Nursery Crime is the album for me. That when I did my sort of favourite Genesis albums, that's what came out at number 1. They find the sound. These musicians come in and rejuvenate them. It's so exciting. You can feel it on the album. But the Genesis sound is in embryo. It's not quite consolidated. On a Foxtrot, they do. And I think their finest moment is Supper's Ready in terms of progressive rock. For me, side 1 is fantastic. Slightly weaker than side 2. Just slightly. They're up against Supper's Ready. Most things would be slightly weaker. So on Selling England by the Pound, the sound, and it's that English aesthetic Genesis sound, it's at its peak. And throughout the whole of this album, it never sags. It doesn't contain for me a Supper's Ready, but it does contain absolutely fantastic Genesis moments. If somebody turned around and said, I think this is Genesis's great album, I wouldn't argue with them, And what we have with all the albums from 1973 are prog bands that have now consolidated their sound and they're delivering it 100%. That's what 73 is about for me. 74, here we have something that I've spotted. After 1973, a lot of the progressive rock bands are then going, right, what do we do now? We've done this. What do we do next? Don't know. We can't just carry on making longer and longer tracks with more sort of, leaping about minstrel, medieval music and orchestra. Now, what do we do next? What? And I think with Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which before I did this channel, if someone had come up to me and say, what's your favourite Genesis album, then I would just say Lamb Lies Down. But Lamb Lies Down seems completely rogue within their catalogue to me. And also, it's a double album, and they're pushing it, a little bit like Topographic Oceans, they're pushing it, and they're trying to push the formula a little bit too far, So again, probably would have been better as an album and a half. There's just a little bit of padding on there. We don't get that with Selling England by the Pound. But Selling England by the Pound is the last of the quirky English Peter Gabriel albums. It's an absolute masterpiece. I've always found I like the production on Lamb and Nursery Crime a little bit more. And I'm not quite sure what I've never liked about the sound. I think most people would not be able to hear that. But there's something delicate about the sound of Nursery Crime. I don't know. But it's up there for me. If you wanted to buy one Genesis album that really represents what they do, you wouldn't go wrong with this album. So that's what I've got at number 3. At number 2, I have The Behemoth. I have an album that will probably go down in history for the general public as being the progressive rock album, in the same way to the general public that Bohemian Rhapsody is the progressive rock tune of all time. This album goes beyond the genre. I went round to my mate's house the other day and I was flicking through his albums. He's a big fan of a lot of 80s rock bands. There was like Cutting Crew and Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. He's got a lot of that stuff. He's a product of that time. So, and then there's a Rogue album. This album's there, Rogue sat there, because everyone's got this album. This album has taken its place in our culture. If it sort of defines the genre so much that I know when I say it, and I'm sure you all know pretty much what it is, there's going to be progressive rock fans arguing that it's not progressive rock. I promise you, there will be people arguing, that's not prog, they're not prog, they're not this, and they'll be coming out with their little reasons why it's not prog, which when you analyse them, it's because they doesn't sound like Yes or Genesis, which are the two bands that seem, for prog fans, define what that is. The reason often stated for why this band is not progressive rock is because of the instrumental virtuosity. Okay? Because they're not virtuosos in the same way as a Yes or a Genesis or a King Crimson. If you expand that argument out, then we can argue that Yes and King Crimson aren't virtuosos because they don't have the same technical virtuosity as Return to Forever or the Mavis Structure, and they don't. Right? Take it from me, I'm a musician. I think this band exhibit more virtuosity than your average pop band. It's in there. I haven't even told you what it is, have I? I'm drawing it out at number 2. It is, of course, Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. How many albums has that sold? 40 million or something. It was on the charts for about 30 years or whatever. When I started talking about progressive rock on this channel, I'd been a Pink Floyd fan. Everyone's a Pink Floyd fan when they're young. And I'd gone off them. You know, that was more because I was never a huge fan of Wish You Were Here. And then in the 80s, when they really do become sort of this plodding, you know, yuppie, Jeremy Clarkson Top Gear band, you know, where they've taken out all the idiosyncrasies and weirdness, and we just basically left with, you know, two chords chugging away, beautifully produced, while, you know, Dave Gilmour plays his absolutely iconic and emotion-filled guitar solos for hours on end, you know. There's so much I don't like about Pink Floyd, but I've forgotten that there's so much I do, right? And I'm not going to go about how much I love the Syd Barrett era or the highly experimental era, how I think Atom Heart Mother is just one of the greatest progressive rock tracks ever, 1970 sidelong epic, how Echoes is absolutely beautiful, you know, and just embodies what progressive rock about. Oh, I just didn't I, you see. I love all that. There's two sides to Pink Floyd. There's the side that the probably one of the most experimental mainstream rock bands of all time. You know, and they explore dark areas. They get into, you know, depressing nooks and crannies of the psychology, you know, the subconscious, you know, life and death, you know, metaphysics, space, time. You know, they're one of those bands that explore all that. And it's dark and twisted and interesting. And they also embody, for me, a little bit of what Dire Straits embody, you know, which is sort of middle of the road rock music that doesn't ruffle the feathers, you know, where you can sit back and appreciate, you know, Dave Gilmour's, you know, beautiful guitar solos before you then go and put a nice Mark Knopfler guitar solo on, or maybe Andy Latimer from Camel, because he's so tasteful as well. He never plays lots of notes. It's not like Aldi Meola and all that crass playing really fast and trying to take your face off, you know, music. It's nice and relaxing, like a warm bath, right? Dark Side of the Moon, for me, this is the point where they cross from one to the other and absolutely get it right, you know. And I don't hate Wish You Were Here. On Wish You Were Here, it's a little bit on the other side. Animals is a little, it's really interesting, great progressive rock album. I could talk about that more. I think that prog is not undone by punk. It's rejuvenated by punk. And most progressive rock bands have the biggest album in their career after they've listened to a little bit of punk rock and pop music and drawn it in. And of course Pink Floyd do that with Animals and really do it with The Wall. But here, 1973, everybody wants that cinematic experience from an album. That we're still in that period. You know, people want to buy an album, take it home, they need a nice gatefold sleeve because they need something to roll their joint up on, and they can sit and smoke their joint and put the album on, and then we can enter into this world, which in case of Dark Side of the Moon has literally, you enter into it, it's got that holophonic sound things where the music seems to wrap round you, you know. And all of us who, when we first put this on, you know, when we heard Breathe, and that he was literally like breathing it out and considering life itself, you know. And the album moves forward, and then we hit Time, and all those alarm clocks come out. And when they come out, they feel like they're in the room. It was at the time, it was a shock. We can breathe and be in the moment, but God, we've got to consider time, anxiety. This album is a masterpiece. It's absolutely brilliant. Anyone who's going to come along and say it's not a progressive rock band, you have not got a clue what progressive rock is. You listen to it like a genre. You're a fan. You're a fan. You haven't thought about it. You just like what you like, and you want it to conform to what you think you should like. It's become too codified. It's become too rigid, right? This is a progressive rock, you know, album on every sense of the definition of a progressive rock is. If you think progressive rock is just instrumental virtuosity, all classical music is progressive rock then, and all jazz is progressive rock. Lots of heavy metal is progressive rock. It's not about that. That's not what progressive rock is. It's about taking the musician on a journey by taking rock music and expanding the boundaries out. It's the integration of the English aesthetic. You know, it's the use of this recording studios, the use of modern technology. It's the use of classical form to create structure. It's not singing about love and singing about, you know, going out and having a good time. It's that. These are all the things that make progressive rock. And Dark Side of the Moon does that probably greater than any other album. You know, I could put on that now, this album now, after hearing it so many times, and I know by the time I got to the end, I would be moved the same as I was back in 1984 when I first heard it, or 83. Absolute masterpiece. I have rethought my attitude towards Pink Floyd. They really are truly one of the great progressive rock bands. They're there in 1966 helping invent the genre. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, they're one of the most avant-garde, innovative bands in the scene. They then make one of the biggest albums of all time with Dark Side of the Moon, and then after punk happens, they then make one of the most commercial prog influence albums with them all of all time. They are there, you know, creating the high points of this genre, and then after Roger Waters leaves, some of the low points. So what have I got at number 1 on my list? What beats Dark Side of the Moon? What have I got at number 1? Well, my argument about 1973 for prog is this. 1972 is where prog gets codified. There's a ton of masterpieces are made, and that's where the world is going, I think this is what progressive rock will be. Oh yeah, brilliant, Close to the Edge, Foxtrot, you know, all these albums are coming out which are like, this is what prog is. Oh, and then the bands of confidence. They go into 73 and they push the envelope, and in most cases you get the outlandish epic prog albums of 1973. And that's what we've been talking about. We are at the peak of the prog summit. The prog mountaineers, there they are, have walked up the peak, and they have got standing in 1973 at the top, looking around, ruling the world. They are at the summit. And they're looking round like this. Can you see them? I'm with my hands. I'm showing you with visual. This is why this isn't a podcast. I do have my visual aids here. They're looking round and they're going, right, so what do we do next? What are we going to do now? Because the only place we're at the top is back down again. There's no other place to go unless you start to change. And this is the big thing I've learned about progressive rock. The critics that say punk comes along in 1977 and gets rid of prog. No, there's a hole there after that. You look in 1974 and we have nowhere near the masterpieces that we have in 1973. Now, people have tried to argue me when I've said this elsewhere by trotting out a whole bunch of quite obscure prog albums by various artists. You know, and yeah, I know Relayer came out in 1974, but Relayer is a change in sound. I know Lamb Lies Down on Broadway came out in 74, but for Genesis it's a change in sound. We see the band start to shift. Right, there's one band, one artist, his name's Robert Fripp, and he's realised this already in 1972-73. He knows that this genre is done. He knows it, and he's looking around to try and take prog in a different direction. And in 1973 comes out Lark's Tongues in Aspic. Right? I think as I'm saying this, I'm just going to check this because now I'm here. I actually want to just check the release date. I really wanted to talk about this album. I'm just going to check the release date while I'm here. So, Lark's Tongues in Aspic, studio album by King Crimson. Was released on the 23rd of March 1973. So I was right, but I feel the groundwork for this is happening almost around 1972, and I'm arguing this because I think the fact that we're March 1973, we know we're only a few weeks away from the 50th anniversary of this album. March 1973, Fripp is always on, or is already on to. There's going to be a change, and with Lark's Tongues in Aspic, that is Fripp again opening the door to the future of progressive rock. All right, I'm just going to get the actual release date. I'm sorry I don't walk around with this stuff in my head. Stylus and the Bible. Black. I know that Red's 1974, and that release date was released in March 74. Yeah, so I am right in this. I didn't make a mistake. You know. The big statement by Fripp and King Crimson is 1973. What is he opening the door to? He's opening the door to a much stripped down sound, a much heavier, much darker sound. He's opening the door to a sound which is much closer to heavy metal. This is the precursor to progressive metal. This is the precursor to grunge. It's also, imagine punk's not there. Fripp, using his own aesthetic centre, is drawing him in a way. So Larks, Tongues and Aspic, I'm not saying it's a punk album, but it has that visceral sound that we associate with rock and roll. He's brought that back into the mix. It rocks. This album rocks. Not all the way through, but a lot of the time it rocks. Larks, Tongues and Aspic opens the door to a trilogy of albums by King Crimson where they rewrite the book on progressive rock. This Stars the Bible Black Red, as we've said. And then in 74, Fripp disappears. When he comes back, he's totally now embedded in sort of post-punk new wave music, which opens the door to the rejuvenation of King Crimson in the 1980s, which then redefines what prog is in the 1980s again. If we think of bands like Rush and how they're going to operate in the later end of the 70s, moving up to Moving Pictures, and what we have there is prog mixed with heavy metal. So 1973, March 1973, Fripp has predicted all that on Larks, Tongues and Aspic. It's also an absolutely flawless album. It's one of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time. Anyway, that there is my 10 greatest prog albums from 1973. All this happened 50 years ago. We will be celebrating the release of these albums and saying how wonderful they are, but hopefully I put a little bit of context around it and made you think a little bit deeper about why are we talking about these albums 50 years later. I hope I've done that. And if you enjoyed me doing that, right, then please like this video. If you want to see my video on the 10 greatest jazz fusion albums of the 1973, then click subscribe and put the notification bell. If you want to pop over to my Patreon and support me in doing this, you know, because I do need support, you know, I know a little bit of extra money just to spend on stuff, you know, so I can get, say, a silent heater in the room. That would be good, wouldn't it? You know, if you want to support me. And I've just acquired a turntable, so I'm actually going to be pulling these albums out for the first time in 25 years and playing them on my Patreon. I'm not going to be doing that here because they'll demonetize me. I need as much money as I can get, you know. I'm not just doing this for love of it, you know. I need a bit of the old cash. We all need a bit of the old cash at the moment. You know, I've got the fan heater running here. Anyone who lives out in the UK will know that, you know, I've spoken to you. I've probably spent 25 quid running this fan heater to keep warm. You know, we're all sat in England with our scarves on and our coats on in the house, not terrified to put the heating on. That's where we're living now. Back in 1973, that wasn't happening. Or was it? Was that when we were getting all those, like, 3-day, you know, weeks and everyone was on strike and we were sat with a power cut around candles? I think it was. Wow, we haven't got that far, have we, in the last 50 years? Anyway, I'm going to finish there, or I'll rabbit on for hours, as you know I can. Thanks for watching. You know, I'll see you in a couple of days on my Jazz Fusion video, and thanks for watching this video and supporting me. Thanks. Bye. Thanks. I can't get out of this one. Just switch the camera off, Andy.